Give me 1 second, everyone.
Wringing his hands and shifting from one foot to the other anxiously. My lady, what do you mean we'll talk? You promised to take this thing off me if I followed the man. You did. And I did, so you have to keep your word. I never said I'd remove the finder, Master Hart. I said you'd be exiled to Bearlawn instead of hanging. Wouldn't you rather remain in Camelin? The man widened his eyes, trying to look sincere, and failing. He even smiled. Oh, no, my lady. I've been dreaming about the fresh country air in Bearlawn, I has. I'll wager there's never a worry about getting rotten meat in your stew there. Here, you got to sniff careful before you eat anything. I'm looking forward to it, I am. Elaine put on the stern face her mother had always worn, passing judgment. You'd be out of Bearlawn 2 minutes behind the guardsman who escorted you there. And then you'd hang for breaking your exile. Much better for you to remain in Camelin and take on a new line of work. Master Nori, could you use a man with Hark's talents? I could, my lady, Nori replied, without even a pause for thought. A satisfied smile touched his thin lips, and Elaine realized what she had done. She had given him a tool to encroach on Arfor's ground, but there was no undoing it now. The work won't be so remunerative as your former trade, Master Hark, but you won't hang for it. So what, my lady? Hark said, scratching his head. It won't pay so well. What do you say? Bearlawn, where you'll surely cut a purse or bolt and hang for either one? Or Camelin, where you'll have steady work and no fear of the hangman, unless you take up cutting purses again. Hark swayed on his feet, scrubbing the back of his hand across his mouth. I need a drink, I does, he muttered hoarsely. Very likely he believed.
Hey, Christopher, how you doing?
Cut a purse.
I hope you're doing well.
Intention of disabusing him. Master Nori scowled at the man, but when he opened his mouth, she said, "There's wine in the small sitting room. Let him have 1 cup, then join me in the large sitting room." The large sitting room was dark when she walked in, but she channeled to light the mirrored stand lamps against the dark paneled walls, and the kindling of the fires neatly laid on the facing hearths. Then she took a seat in one of the low-backed chairs around the scroll-edged table, and released Saidar again. Since her experiment at holding the power all day, she had not held it longer than necessary. Her mood swung from joyful excitement to morose worry and back. On the one hand, she was done with having to put up with Melar, and soon she would have her hands on 2 black sisters. Questioning them might lead to the rest, or at least reveal their plans. And if not, this Cheyenne would have her own secrets. Anyone who was working 2 Dark-Friend sisters would have secrets worth knowing. On the other hand, what would Duhara do to try forcing her acceptance as an advisor? Duhara would try to meddle somehow, but she could not see how. Burn her. She did not need any more difficulties between her and the throne. With a little luck, tonight would not only snare 2 black sisters, it might uncover a third.
Give me 1 second, everyone.
Times over. Back and forth she went, from Phalion and Marilyn to Duhara, even after Master Nori and Hark joined her. Hark, a silver cup in his hand, tried to take a seat at the table, but Master Nori tapped him on the shoulder and jerked his head toward a corner. Sullenly, Hark went where he was directed. He must have begun drinking as soon as the cup was filled, because he emptied it in one long pull, then stood turning it over in his hands and staring at it. Suddenly, he gave a start and directed an ingratiating grin at her. Whatever he saw on her face made him flinch. Scuttling to the long table against the wall, he set the cup down with exaggerated care, then scuttled back to his corner. Birgitta was the first to arrive, the bond filled with weary discontent. "Arrived?" she said, and when Elaine explained, she began raising objections. Well, some of it was objections. The rest was just insults. "What hair-brained, crack-pated scheme are you talking about, Birgitta?" Van Deen said as she entered the room. She wore a riding dress that hung loose on her. One of her sisters, it would have fit her perfectly while Adelius was alive, but the white-haired woman had lost weight. Her Jaime, wiry and gnarled, took one look at Hark and placed himself where he could watch the man. Hark ventured a smile, but it faded when Jaime's expression remained hard as iron. The warder's graying hair was thin, but there was nothing soft about him. "She intends to try capturing 2 black sisters tonight," Birgitta replied, shooting a hard look at Elaine. "2 black sisters?" Sarita exclaimed, walking through the door. She gathered her dark cloak around her as though the words had given a chill. "Who?" Her warder Ned, a tall, broad-shouldered young man with yellow hair, eyed Hark and touched his sword hilt. He chose a spot where he could watch the man, too. Hark shifted his feet. He might have been thinking of trying to run. "Phalion Boda and Marilyn Gamalfin," Elaine said. Sarita's mouth hardened. "What about Phalion and Marilyn?" Cariana asked as she glided into the room. Her warders were disparate men, a tall, gangly Tyran, a blade-slender Saldaean, and a broad-shouldered Kyrianan. They exchanged glances, and Taven, the Kyrianan, leaned against the wall watching Hark, while Sierra and Venner stood in the doorway. Hark's mouth took on a sickly twist. There was nothing for it but to explain again from the beginning, which Elaine did with a rising impatience that had nothing to do with her shifting moods. The longer this took, the more chance that Phalion and Marilyn might be gone by the time she reached the house on Full Moon Street. She wanted them. She intended to have them. She should have made Birgitta wait until everyone had gathered. "A good plan, I think," Van Deen said when she finished. "Yes, it will do nicely." Others were not so agreeable. "It isn't a plan, it's bloody madness," Birgitta said sharply. Arms folded beneath her bosom, she scowled down at Elaine, the bond such a turmoil of emotions that Elaine could barely make them out. "The 4 of you enter the house alone." "Alone? That isn't a plan. It's flaming insanity. Warders are supposed to guard their Aes Sedai's backs. Let us come with you." The other warders put in emphatic agreements, but at least she was not trying to stop the whole thing anymore. "There are 4 of us," Elaine told her. "We can watch our own backs. And sisters do not ask their warders to face other sisters." Brigitta's face darkened. "If I need you, I'll shout so loud you'll be able to hear me if you were back here in the palace. The warders remain outside," she added when Birgitta opened her mouth. The bond filled with frustration, but Birgitta's jaw snapped shut. "Perhaps this man can be trusted," Sarita said, glancing at Hark with no trust at all. "But even if he heard correctly, nothing says there are still only 2 sisters in the house, or any. If they have gone, there's no danger, but if others have joined them, we might as well put our necks in a noose and spring the trap ourselves." Cariana folded her sturdy arms and nodded. "The danger is too great. You yourself told us that when they fled the tower, they stole a number of Turangrial, some very dangerous indeed. I've never been called a coward, but I don't fancy trying to sneak up on someone who might have a rod that can make balefire." He could hardly have misheard something as simple as, "There are only 2 of us," Elaine replied firmly. "And they spoke as if they didn't expect any others. Burn her? Considering her standing with respect to them, they should have been jumping to obey rather than arguing. In any case, this isn't a discussion." Pity both objected. If only one had, it could have been a clue. Unless they both were Black Aja. A bone-freezing thought, that. Yet her plan took the possibility into account. Phalian and Marilyn won't know we are coming until it's too late. If they're gone, we'll arrest this Cheyenne, but we are going. It was a larger party than Elaine had expected that rode out of the Queen's stable yard behind her and Hark. Birgitta had insisted on bringing 50 guardswomen, though all they would be doing was missing sleep. A column of twos in red lacquered helmets and breastplates, black in the night, that snaked along the palace behind the Aes Sedai and warders. Reaching the front of the palace, they skirted the edge of the Queen's Plaza, the great oval crowded now with rude shelters that housed sleeping guardsmen and nobles' armsmen. Men were billeted everywhere room could be found, but there were insufficient basements and attics and spare rooms near enough the palace, and the parks where circles of kinswomen would take the men to the places where they were needed. The fighting they did was afoot, on the walls, so their horses were all picketed in nearby parks and in the larger palace gardens. A few sentries shifted as they passed, heads swiveling to follow, but with her hood up, all they could be sure of was that a large contingent of guardswomen were escorting a party through the night. The sky to the east was still dark, but it must be less than 2 hours till first light. The light sen dawn would see Phalian and Marilyn in custody, and one more. At least one more. Winding streets led over and around the hills, past narrow, tile-covered towers that would glitter with 100 colors when the sun rose, and glittered faintly in the cloud-dappled moonlight. Past silent shops and lightless inns, simple stone houses with slate roofs, and small palaces that might have fit in Tarvalon. The ring of horseshoes on the paving stones and the faint creak of saddle leather sounded loud in the silence. Except for an occasional dog that slunk away into the deeper shadows of alleys, nothing else moved. The streets were dangerous at this hour, but no footpad would be mad enough to come in sight of so large a party. Half an hour after leaving the royal palace, Elaine rode Fireheart through the Mondel Gate, a wide 20-foot-high arch in the inner city's tall white wall. Once there would have been guardsmen on duty there to keep the peace, but the Queen's guards were spread too thin now for that. Almost as soon as they were into the new city, Hark turned east into a warren of streets that meandered in every direction through the city's hills. He rode awkwardly on a bay mare that had been found for him. Cut purses seldom spent time in the saddle. Some of the streets were quite narrow here, and it was in one of those that he finally drew rein, surrounded by stone houses of 2 or 3 or even 4 stories. Birgitta raised a hand to halt the column. The sudden silence seemed deafening. "It's just around that corner there, it is, my lady, the other side of the street," Hark said in a near whisper. "But if we go riding out there, they might hear us or see us. Pardon, my lady, but if these Aes Sedai are what you says they are, I don't want them seeing me." He scrambled down from his saddle clumsily and looked up at her, wringing his hands, his moon-shadowed face anxious. Dismounting, Elaine led Fireheart to the corner and peeked around the corner of a narrow 3-story house. The houses along the other street stood dark except for one, 4 substantial stories of stone, with the closed gate of a stable yard beside it. Not an ornate building, but large enough for a wealthy merchant or banker. Bankers and merchants were unlikely to be awake at this hour, however. "There," Hark whispered hoarsely, pointing. He stood far back, so he had to lean forward to point. He really did fear being seen. "The one with the light on the 2nd floor, it is." "Best to find out if anyone else is awake in there," Van Deen said, peering past Elaine. "Jane, don't go inside the house." Elaine expected the lean old warder to sneak across the street, but he just strolled out, holding his cloak close around him against the early morning chill. Even the dangerous grace of a warder appeared to have deserted him. Van Deen seemed to sense her surprise. "Skulking draws the eye and creates suspicion," she said. "Jane is just a man walking, and if it's early to be out in the streets, he isn't sneaking, so anyone who sees him will think of some mundane reason for him to be out." Reaching the stable yard gate, Jane pulled it open and walked through as if he had a perfect right. Long minutes passed before he came back out, shutting the gate carefully behind him, and strolled back along the street. He rounded the corner and the leopard-like grace reappeared in his step. "All the windows are dark except that one," he told Van Deen quietly. "The kitchen door is unlatched, so is the back door. That lets onto an alley. Trusting for dark friends, or else dangerous enough they don't worry about burglars. There's a big fellow sleeping in the barn up in the loft. Big enough to scare any burglar, but he's so drunk he didn't wake while I was tying him up." Van Deen raised a questioning eyebrow. "I thought I'd better be safe. Drunks sometimes wake when you least expect. You wouldn't want him seeing you go in and start making noise." She nodded approval. "It's time to get ready," Elaine said. Moving back from the corner and handing her reins to Birgitta, she tried to embrace the source. It was like trying to catch smoke with her fingers. Frustration and anger welled up, all the things you needed to suppress if you were to channel. She tried again and failed again. Phalion and Marilyn were going to get away, to come this close. They had to be in that lighted room. She knew it, and they were going to escape. Sadness replaced anger, and suddenly Saidar flowed into her. She barely stifled a sigh of relief. "I'll meld the flows, Sarita. Van Deen, you meld for Cariana." "Don't understand why we have to link," the Tyrant Brown muttered, but she put herself on the edge of embracing the power. "With 2 of them and 4 of us, we outnumber them, but linked it's 2 and 2. A clue. Perhaps she wished it to be 3 and 3. 2 strong enough to overwhelm them, even if they're holding the power, Sarita." Elaine reached through her as if she were an Angreal, and the glow of Saidar surrounded the other woman as the link was completed. In truth, it surrounded both of them, but she could only see the part around Sarita, until she wove spirit around her. Then the glow vanished. She placed the same weave on herself and prepared 4 shields and several other weaves, all inverted. She felt almost giddy with excitement, but she did not intend to be caught by surprise. Frustration still pulsed along the bond, but for the rest, Birgitta felt like a drawn arrow. Elaine touched her arm. "We will be all right." Birgitta snorted and flung her thick braid back over her shoulder. "Keep an eye on Master Hark, Birgitta. It would be a shame if he had to be hanged because he was tempted to run." Hark squeaked. She exchanged glances with Van Deen, who said, "We might as well be about it." 4 of them walked up Full Moon Street slowly, as if out for a stroll, and slipped into the shadow-shrouded stable yard. Elaine opened the kitchen door slowly, but the hinges were well oiled, emitting not a squeak. The brick-walled kitchen was lit only by a tiny fire in the wide stone fireplace where a kettle hung steaming, yet that was enough for them to cross the floor without bumping into the table or chairs. Someone sighed, and she pressed a warning finger to her lips. Van Deen frowned at Cariana, who looked embarrassed and spread her hands. A short hall led to stairs at the front of the house. Gathering her skirts, Elaine started up, silent on slippered feet. She was careful to keep Sarita where she could see her. Van Deen was doing the same with Cariana. They could do nothing with the power, but that hardly meant they could do nothing. On the second flight of stairs, she began hearing the murmur of voices. Light spilled from an open door. "Don't care what you think," a woman said in the room. "You leave the thinking to me and do as you're told." Elaine moved to the door. It was a sitting room with gilded stand lamps and rich carpets on the floor and a tall fireplace of blue marble, but she had eyes only for the 3 women in it. Only one, a sharp-faced woman, was seated. That must be Cheyenne. The other 2 stood with their backs to the door, heads bowed like penitents. The sharp-faced woman's eyes widened when she saw her in the doorway, but Elaine gave her no time to open her mouth. The 2 black sisters cried out in alarm as shields went onto them, and flows of air bound their arms to their sides, tightened their skirts around their legs. More flows of air fastened Cheyenne to her gilded armchair. Elaine drew Sarita into the room with her and moved to where she could see all of their faces. Sarita tried to step back. She might only have been trying to give her the place of prominence, but Elaine caught her sleeve again, keeping her in view too. Van Deen and Cariana joined them. Marilyn's narrow face held Aes Sedai calm, but Phalion snarled silently. "What is the meaning of this?" Cheyenne demanded. I recognize you. You're Elaine Trakand, the daughter heir, but that gives you no right to invade my home and assault me. Phalien Boda, Elaine said calmly. Marilyn Gamalfin, Cheyenne Avarhin, I arrest you as dark friends. Well, her voice was calm. Inside, she wanted to skip with glee, and Birgitta thought this would be dangerous. That is ridiculous, Cheyenne said in icy tones. I walk in the light. Not if you walk with these two, Elaine told her. To my certain knowledge, they've proven themselves Black Aja in Tarvalon, Tyr, and Tanchico. You don't hear them denying it, do you? That's because they know I... Suddenly, sparks danced all over her from head to toe. She twitched helplessly, muscles spasming, Saidar slipping from her grasp. She could see Vandine and Kariana and Saritha jerking as sparks flickered across them as well. Only a moment it lasted, but when the sparks vanished, Elaine felt as if she had been fed through a mangle. She had to hold on to Saritha to stay on her feet, and Saritha clung to her as hard. Vandine and Kariana were supporting one another, swaying, each
cheers, Chris.
Phalien and Marilyn wore startled expressions.
Using my GoPro today. Couldn't get on with using my laptop for some reason.
There was no need for binding. Any of them would have fallen over without support. She would have shouted if she could have, if she thought that Birgitta and the others could do more than die. 4 women Elaine recognized entered the room. Asni Zeramine and Tamila Kinderode. Chesmal Emry and Eldrith Jondar. 4 black sisters. She could have wept. Saritha groaned softly. Why did you wait so long? Asni demanded of Phalien and Marilyn. The Saldeans' dark, tilted eyes were angry. I used this so they wouldn't feel us embrace Saidar, but why did you just stand there? She waved a small, bent black rod, perhaps an inch in diameter, that had a strangely dull look. The thing seemed to fascinate her. A gift from Moghedin, a weapon from the Age of Legends. I can kill a man at 100 paces with this, or just stun him if I want to put him to the question. I can kill a man if I can see him, Chesmal said scornfully. Tall and handsome, she was the image of icy arrogance. Asni sniffed. But my target could be surrounded by 100 sisters, and not one would know what killed him. I suppose it has its uses, Chesmal admitted in grudging tones. Why did you just stand there? They had us shielded, Phalien said bitterly. Eldrith's breath caught, and she put a plump hand to a round cheek. That's impossible. Unless... Her dark eyes sharpened. They've discovered a way to hide the glow, to hide their weaves. Now that would be most useful. You have my thanks for your timely rescue, Cheyenne said, rising. But do you have a reason for coming here tonight? Did Moradin send you? Asni channeled a flow of air that struck Cheyenne's cheek with a loud crack, staggering her. Keep a civil tongue in your mouth, and perhaps we'll let you leave with us. Or we can leave you behind, dead. Cheyenne's cheek was reddened, but her hands remained at her sides. Her face was expressionless. Elaine's the only one we need, Tamila said. She was pretty in a fox-faced way, almost a fragile child in appearance despite her ageless face, but her blue eyes held an unhealthy light. She touched her lips with the tip of her tongue. I'd enjoy playing with the others, but they'd be a burden we don't need. If you're going to kill them, Marilyn said, as though discussing the price of bread, spare Kariana. She is one of us. A gift from Adelius, Vandine murmured, and Kariana's eyes went very wide. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The 2 women sagged and fell to the carpet. Vandine began trying to push herself up, but Kariana lay staring at the ceiling, the hilt of Vandine's belt knife protruding from beneath her breastbone. The glow surrounded Chesmal, and she touched Vandine with a complex weave of fire, earth, and water. The white-haired woman collapsed, as if her bones had melted. The same weave touched Saritha, and she pulled Elaine down atop her as she fell. Saritha's eyes were already glazing. Their warders will be coming now, Chesmal said. A little more killing to do. Run, Birgitta, Elaine thought, wishing the bond could carry words. Run! Chapter 32. To keep the bargain. Birgitta was leaning against the stone wall of the 3-story house, thinking sadly of Guido, when the bundle of emotions and physical sensations in the back of her head, her awareness of Elaine, suddenly spasmed. That was the only word for it. Whatever it was lasted just a moment, but afterward the bond was full of limpness. Elaine was conscious, but unsteady. She was unafraid, however. Still, Birgitta threw back her cloak and moved to the corner to peer up Full Moon Street. Elaine could be too brave for her own good. The hardest thing about being Elaine's warder was keeping her from endangering herself beyond need. Nobody was indestructible, but the bloody woman thought she bloody well was. Her sigil should have been an iron lion rather than a golden lily. That light shone in the window, spilling a pale pool into the narrow street, and there was not a sound except for a cat yowling somewhere in the night. Saritha feels muzzy, Ned Yarman muttered beside her. The tall young warder's boyish face was a grim shadowed mask inside the hood of his cloak. She feels weak. Birgitta became aware of the other warders crowding her close, stone-faced and hard-eyed. That was clear enough even by moonlight. Something had happened to all of the Aes Sedai, it seemed. But what? Lady Elaine said she'd shout if she needed us, she told them, as much to reassure herself as anything else. Even if both Cariana and Saritha were dark friends, they would have been helpless to do anything linked, and apparently whatever had happened to them as well. Burn her. She should have insisted that she and the other warders go along. Ariana won't be pleased if we interfere needlessly, Venner Kosan said quietly. Blade slim and dark, with touches of white in his tightly curled black hair and short beard, he appeared completely at ease. I say we wait. She feels confident, whatever's going on. More so than she did going in, Sierra Larjuna added, earning him a sharp glance from Venner. Still short of his middle years, Sierra seemed all bones, though his shoulders were wide. Birgitta nodded. Elaine was confident, too. But then Elaine would feel self-assured walking an unraveling rope stretched over a pit full of sharp stakes. A dog began barking in the distance, and the yowling cat went silent, but other dogs answered the first in a spreading ripple that faded away as suddenly as it had begun. They waited, with Birgitta fretting in silence. Suddenly Venner growled an oath and shed his cloak. The next instant his blade was in his hand and he was running up the street, followed by Sierra and Taven, cloaks billowing behind, their blades bared too. Before they had gone 2 steps, Jaime gave a wild cry. Unsheathing his sword, he threw his cloak down and raced after the other 3 at a speed that belied his age. Bellowing with rage, Ned ran too, the steel in his fist glittering in the moonlight. Fury stabbed through the bond, back with Ned, and too, but still no fear. Birgitta heard the soft rasp of swords being unsheathed behind her and spun, cloak flaring. Put those up. They're no use here. I know what the warders running in means as well as you, my lady, Urith said in courtly accents, obeying smoothly, and with clear reluctance. Lean and as tall as most men, the Saldaean denied being nobly born, but whenever the conversation came around to what she had done before swearing the oath as a hunter for the Horn, she always gave one of her rare smiles and changed the subject. She was skilled with that sword, however. If the Aes Sedai are dying, Elaine is alive, Birgitta cut in. Alive and in trouble. She's our concern now, but we'll need a lot more swords to rescue her. And more than swords. Somebody collar that man. 2 guardswomen seized Hark's coat before he could slip away into the darkness. Apparently he had no wish to stay near where Aes Sedai had died. Neither did she. Gather the extra horses and follow me, she said, swinging into Arrow's saddle. And ride like fire. She suited her words, digging her heels into the rangy gray gelding's flanks without waiting. It was a wild gallop through dark, twisting streets where people were just beginning to appear. She rained arrow around the few carts and wagons out this early, but men and women had to leap from her path, often shaking fists and shouting curses. She only urged the gelding for more speed, her cloak flapping behind. Before she reached the Mondale gate, Elaine was moving. She had been uncertain at first, but there could be no mistaking it now. Elaine was moving northeast at about walking speed. The bonds said she was too wobbly to walk far, maybe to walk at all, but a wagon would make the same pace. The sky was turning gray. How long before she could gather what was needed? In the inner city, the street spiraled inward, rising past towers glittering in 100 colors toward the golden domes and pale spires of the royal palace atop the highest of Canelan's hills. As she galloped around the rim of the Queen's Plaza, soldiers stared at her. They were being fed from black kettles atop push barrows, cooks ladling some sort of brown stew onto tin plates, and every man she could see wore his breastplate and had his helmet hanging from his sword hilt. Good. Every moment saved was a moment towards saving Elaine. 2 lines of guardswomen were practicing the sword in the Queen's stable yard when she galloped in, but the lath blade stopped rattling when she flung herself out of the saddle, let Arrow's reins drop, and ran toward the colonnade. "Hadora, run tell the Windfinders to meet me in the map room right away," she shouted without slowing. "All of them! Senator, you do the same for Captain Guybon, and have another horse saddled for me." Arrow was played out for today. She was past the columns by that time, but she did not look back to see whether they were obeying. They would be. She raced through tapestry-hung hallways and up sweeping marble stairs, got lost and shouted curses as she retraced her steps at a run. Liveried serving men and women gaped as they dodged out of her way. At last she reached the lion-carved doors of the map room, where she paused only long enough to tell the 2 burly guardsmen on duty to admit the Windfinders as soon as they appeared, then went in. Guybon was already there, in his burnished breastplate with the 3 golden knots on his shoulder, and Dialyn, delicately holding her blue silk skirts up as she moved, the pair of them frowning at the huge mosaic map, where well over a dozen red discs marked the city's northern wall. Never before had there been so many assaults at once, not even 10, but Birgitta spared the discs barely a glance. "Guybon, I need every horse and halberd you can muster," she said, unpinning her cloak and tossing it down on her long writing table. "The crossbowmen and archers will have to handle anything that crops up by themselves for a few hours. Elaine's been captured by Dark Friend Aes Sedai, and they're trying to carry her out of the city." Some of the clerks and messengers began murmuring, but Mistress Anford silenced them with a sharp order to see to their work. Birgitta eyed the colorful map in the floor, measuring distances. Elaine seemed to be moving toward the Sunrise Gate and the road to the River Aranin, but even if they used one of the smaller gates, they had gone too far to be aiming at anything but the eastern wall. "They'll probably have her through the gates by the time we're ready to move. We're going to travel to just this side of the ridge east of the city, and take what was going to happen out of the streets, away from people's homes. It would be better out in the open in any case. In that tangle of streets with horsemen and halberdmen jammed together, there would be too many people to get in the way, too much chance of accidents." Guybon nodded, already issuing terse orders that brown-clad clerks copied down hastily for him to sign, and
Gotta
passed
clean
to
that
young
screen out.
messengers in red and white, who went running as soon as the paper was in hand. The boys' faces were frightened. Birgitta had no time for her own fear. Elaine felt none, and she was a prisoner. Sadness, yes, but no fear. "We certainly need to rescue Elaine," Dialyn said calmly. "But she'll hardly thank you if you give Aramilla Canelan by doing it. Not counting the men in the towers and holding the gates, almost half the trained soldiers and armsmen in the city are on the northern wall. If you strip away the rest, one more attack will gain a stretch of the wall. Crossbows and bows alone won't stop them. Once they have that, Aramilla's forces will pour into the city, enough to overwhelm what you propose to leave. You will have neatly reversed our positions, and worsened ours. Aramilla will have Canelan, and Elaine will be outside without enough armsmen to get back in. Unless these Dark Friends have somehow smuggled an army inside Canelan, a few hundred men will do as well as thousands." Birgitta scowled at her. She'd never been able to like Dialyn. She did not know why exactly, but Dialyn had just made her bristle at first sight. She was fairly certain the other woman felt the same about her. She could never say up without Dylan saying down. You care about putting Elaine on the throne, Dylan. I care about keeping her alive to mount that throne. Or not, so long as she's alive. I owe her my life, and I won't let hers trickle away in dark friend hands. Dylan sniffed and went back to studying the red discs as if she could see the soldiers fighting, her frown deepening the lines at the corners of her eyes. Birgitta clasped her hands behind her back and forced herself to stand still. She wanted to pace with impatience. Elaine was still trundling toward the sunrise gate. There's something you need to know, Guybon. We'll be facing at least 2 Aes Sedai, likely more, and they may have a weapon. A Turangrial that makes balefire. Have you ever heard of that? Never. It sounds dangerous, though. Oh, it is. Dangerous enough that it's prohibited for Aes Sedai. In the War of the Shadow, even Dark Friends stopped using it. She barked a bitter laugh. All she knew of balefire now was what Elaine had told her. It had come from her in the first place, yet that only made matters worse. Would all of her memories go? She did not think she had lost any recently, but how would she know if she had? She could remember bits of the founding of the White Tower, pieces of what she and Guidel had done to help it be founded, but nothing before that. All of her earlier memories were yesterday's smoke. Well, at least we'll have Aes Sedai of our own, Guybon said, signing another order. They're all dead, except for Elaine, she told him flatly. There was no way to gild that. Dylan gasped, her face growing pale. One of the clerks clasped her hands to her mouth, and another knocked over his ink jar. The ink fanned across the tabletop in a black stream and began dripping onto the floor. Rather than reprimanding the man, Mistress Anford steadied herself with a hand on another clerk's writing table. I hope to make up for that, Birgitta went on. But I can't promise anything except that we're going to lose men today. Maybe a lot of men. Guybon straightened. His expression was thoughtful, his hazel eyes steady. That will make for an interesting day, he said finally. But we'll get the daughter heir back, whatever the cost. A solid man, Charles Guybon, and brave. He had demonstrated that often enough on the walls. Too good-looking for her taste, of course. Birgitta realized she had begun pacing back and forth across the mosaic and stopped. She knew nothing of being a general, whatever Elaine thought, but she knew that showing nerves could infect others with them. Elaine was alive. That was all that was important. Alive and moving further away by the minute. The left-hand door opened, and one of the burly guardsmen announced that Julania Fote and Karaila Sertofni had returned. Guybon hesitated, looking to her, but when she said nothing, he told the man to admit them. They were very different women, in appearance at least, though each carried a wooden walking staff. Julania was plump and pretty, with touches of white in her dark hair, while Karaila was short and slim, with tilted green eyes and fiery red curls. Birgitta wondered whether those were their real names. These kinswomen changed names as easily as other women changed stockings. They wore plain woolens suitable for country peddlers, which each had been in the past, and each was a keen observer, skilled at taking care of herself. They could talk their way out of most situations, but their simple belt knives were not the only blades they carried, and they could surprise a strong man with what they could do with those walking staffs. Both offered curtsies. Julania's skirts and cloak were damp and splashed with mud around the hem. Elorian, Luan, and Abella began breaking camp early this morning, my lady, she said. I only stayed long enough to make sure of their direction, north, before coming to report. The same is true with Aemlyn, Arathella, and Pelavar, my lady, Karaila added. They're coming for Caemlyn. Birgitta did not need to examine the large map spread out on the table with its markers. Depending on how muddy the roads were, how much rain they had to contend with, they could reach the city by that afternoon. You've done well, both of you. Go find yourselves hot baths. Do you think they've had a change of heart? She asked Dylan once the two women had left. No, the woman replied without hesitation, then sighed and shook her head. I fear the most likely thing is that Elorian has convinced the others to support her for the Lion Throne. They may be thinking to defeat Aramilla and take over the siege. They have half again her numbers and double ours. She let that hang. There was no need to say the rest. Even using kinswomen to shift men, they would be hard-pressed to hold the wall against that many. First, we get Elaine back. Then we can worry about that lot, Birgitta said. Where were those bloody windfinders? No sooner did she have the thought than they were padding into the room behind Shanella, a riotous rainbow of silks. Except for Renila, last in line in her linens, yet a red blouse, green trousers, and a deep yellow sash made her bright enough. Though even Rainin, a round-cheeked young woman with just half a dozen golden medallions dangling onto her cheek, made Renila's honor chain look bare. Renila's face wore an expression of stoic endurance. I do not appreciate being threatened, Shanella said angrily, sniffing the golden scent box on its golden chain around her neck. Her dark cheeks were flushed. That guardswoman said if we did not run, she would kick. Never mind what she said exactly. It was a threat, and I will not be. Elaine has been captured by Dark Friend Aes Sedai, Birgitta cut in. I need you to make a gateway for the men who are going to rescue her. A murmur rose among the other windfinders. Shanella gestured, only Renila fell silent. The others just lowered their voices to whispers to her obvious displeasure. By the medallions crowding their honor chains, several of them matched Shanella's rank. Why did you summon all of us for one gateway, she demanded. I keep the bargain, you can see. I brought everyone as you ordered, but why do you need more than one? Because you're all going to form a circle and make a gateway big enough to take thousands of men and horses. That was wondrous. Shanella stiffened, and she was not alone. Gurin, her face like a black stone, practically quivered with outrage, and Risail, normally a very dignified woman, did quiver. Senina, with her weathered face and old marks indicating she once had worn more than 6 earrings, and fatter ones, fingered the jeweled dagger thrust behind her green sash. Soldiers, Shanella said indignantly. That is forbidden. Our bargain says we will take no part in your war. Zaida din Parida Blackwing commanded it so. And now that she is mistress of the ships, that command carries even greater weight. Use the kinswomen. Use the Aes Sedai. Birgitta stepped close to the dark woman, looking her straight in the eyes. The kin were useless for this. None of them had ever used the power as a weapon. They might not even know how. The other Aes Sedai are dead, she said softly. Someone behind her moaned, one of the clerks. What is your bargain worth if Elaine is lost? Aramilla certainly won't honor it. Keeping her voice steady, saying that took effort. It wanted to shake with anger, shake with fear. She needed these women, but she could not let them know why, or Elaine would be lost. What will Zaida say if you ruin her bargain with Elaine? Shanella's tattooed hand half lifted the piercework scent box to her nose again, then let it fall among her many jeweled necklaces. From what Birgitta knew of Zaida din Parida, she would be more than displeased with anyone who wrecked that bargain, and it was beyond doubtful that Shanella wished to face the woman's anger, yet she only looked pensive. Very well, she said after a moment. For transport only, though. It is agreed? She kissed the fingertips of her right hand, prepared to seal the bargain. You only need do what you want, Birgitta said, turning away. Gaibon, it's time. They must have her to the gate by now. Gaibon buckled on his sword, took up his helmet and steel-backed gauntlets, and followed her and Dialin out of the map room, trailed by the windfinders, with Shanella loudly insisting that they would provide a gateway only. Birgitta whispered instructions to Gaibon before leaving him striding toward the front of the palace, while she hurried to the Queen's stable yard, where she found a hammer-nosed dun gelding wearing her saddle and waiting, the reins held by a young groom with her hair in a braid not much different from her own. She also found all 121 guardswomen armored and mounted. Climbing into the dun's saddle, she motioned them to follow her. The sun was a golden ball clear of the horizon, in a sky with only a few high white clouds. At least they would not have rain to contend with, too. Even a wagon might have been able to slip away in some of the heavy rainstorms Camelin had seen lately. A thick snake of men, 10 and 12 abreast, spanned the Queen's plaza now, Stretching out of sight in both directions, horsemen in helmets and breastplates, alternating with men in every sort of helmet imaginable, carrying shouldered halberds, most wearing mail shirts or jerkins sewn with steel discs, and only rarely a breastplate. Each group, large or small, headed by the banner of its house, or the banner of a mercenary company. The cell swords would have too many watchers to try slacking off today. Minus the crossbowmen and archers, there would be close on 12,000 men in that column, 2/3 of them mounted. How many would be dead before noon? She pushed that thought out of her mind. She needed every one of them.
Oh yeah, cheers. Just smoking a
Any man who died today could die as
pin
easily
now.
on the wall tomorrow. Every man of them had come to Camelin prepared to die for Elaine. At the head of the column were better than 1,000 guardsmen, helmets and gleaming in the sun, steel-tipped lances slanted precisely, the first of them waiting behind the banner of Andor, the rearing white lion on a field of scarlet, and Elaine's banner, the golden lily on blue, at the edge of one of Camelin's many parks. It had been a park anyway, but oaks hundreds of years old had been cut down and hauled away along with all the other trees and the flowering bushes, their roots dug out to clear a smooth space 100 paces wide. The graveled paths and grassy ground had long since been trampled to mud by hooves and boots. 3 other parks around the palace had received the same treatment to make places for weaving gateways. Gaibon and Dialin were already there, along with all the lords and ladies who had answered Elaine's call, from young Perival Mantiar to Brannin Martin and his wife, all mounted. Perival wore helmet and breastplate like every other male present. Brannin's were plain and dull and slightly dented where the armorer's hammer had failed its task, tools of his trade as surely as the plain-hilted swords scabbarded at his side. Perival's were as gilded as conils and branlets, worked with the silver anvil of Mantiar, where theirs were lacquered with Northam's black eagles, and covered with being seen in. Birgitta hoped Elaine had sense enough to keep those boys out of any fighting. Looking at some of those women's faces, grim and determined, she hoped they had sense enough to stay clear themselves. At least none was wearing a sword. The simple truth was, a woman had to be more skilled than a man to face him with a sword. Stronger arms made too much difference otherwise. Much better to use a bow. The Windfinders were grimacing as they shifted their bare feet uneasily on ground still muddy from yesterday's downpour. Wet they were more than accustomed to, but not mud. "This man will not tell me where the gateway is to reach," Shanella said furiously, pointing to Gaibon as Birgitta dismounted. "I want to be done so I can wash my feet." "My lady," a woman's voice called from back down the street. "My lady Birgitta!" Rena Harfor came running up the line of guardsmen, her red skirts held high, exposing her stockinged legs to the knee. Birgitta did not think she had ever seen the woman so much as trot. Mistress Harfor was one of those women who always did everything perfectly. Every time they met, she made Birgitta conscious of every last mistake she herself had ever made. 2 men in red and white livery were running behind her, carrying a litter between them. When they came closer, Birgitta saw that it held a lanky, helmetless guardsman with an arrow piercing his right arm and another jutting from his right thigh. Blood trickled down both shafts, so he left a thin trail of drops on the paving stones. "He insisted on being brought to you or Captain Gaibon immediately, my lady," Mistress Harfor said breathlessly, fanning herself with one hand. The young guardsman struggled to sit up until Birgitta pressed him back down. 3 or 4 companies of mercenaries are attacking the Farmatic Gate, my lady," he said, pain racking his face and tinging his voice. "From inside the city, I mean. They placed archers to shoot anyone who tried to wave the signal flags for help. But I managed to get away, and my horse lasted just long enough." Birgitta growled an oath. Cordwin, Gomaisen, and Bakovan would be among them, she was ready to wager. They should have pressed Elaine to put them in the city as soon as they made their demands. She did not realize she had spoken aloud until the wounded guardsman spoke up. "No, my lady. Leastwise, not Bakovan. Him and a dozen or so of his men dropped by to to pass the time, and the lieutenant figures they're the only reason we've managed to hold on. If they are still holding. They were using battering rams outdoors when I looked back. But there's more, my lady. There's men massing in Low Canelan outside the gates. 10,000, maybe twice that. Hard to tell the way those streets twist. Birgitta winced. 10,000 men would be enough to carry an assault from the outside, whether or not the mercenaries were held off, unless she sent everything, and she could not. What in the light? Burn her. She could plan a raid to rescue someone from a fortress or scout in country held by the enemy with confidence that she knew what she was doing. But this was a battle, with the fate of Canelan and maybe the throne in the balance. Still, she had it to do. Mistress Harford, take this man back to the palace and see his wounds tended, please. There was no point in asking the Windfinders for healing. They had already made it clear that was taking part in the war in their view. Dylan, leave me all of the horse and 1,000 halberdmen. You take the rest and all of the crossbowmen and archers available, and every man you can scrape together who can hold a sword. If the gate is still holding when the kinswomen get you there, make sure it continues to hold. If it's fallen, take it back, and hold that bloody wall till I can get there. Very well, Dylan said, as if those were the easiest orders in the world to carry out. Conile, Catalin, Branlet, Paraval, you come with me. Your foot will fight better with you there. Conile looked disappointed, no doubt seeing himself riding in a gallant charge, but he gathered his reins and whispered something that made the two younger boys chuckle. So will my horse fight better, Catalin protested. I want to help rescue Elaine. You came to help her secure the throne, Dylan said sharply. And you'll go where you're needed to see to that, or you and I will have another talk later. Whatever that meant, Catalin's plump face reddened, but she sullenly followed Dylan and the others when they rode away. Gaibon looked at Birgitta, yet he said nothing, though likely he was wondering why she was not sending more. He would not challenge her publicly. The problem was she did not know how many Black Sisters would be with Elaine. She needed every Windfinder, needed them to believe they were all necessary. Had there been time, she would have seen the from the outer towers. She told Shanella. To just this side of the ridge, east of the city, right on top of the Aranin Road, away from the city. Windfinders gathered in a circle, doing whatever they had to do to link and taking their bloody time about it. Suddenly, the vertical silver-blue slash of a gateway appeared, widening into an opening, 5 paces tall, and covering the whole width of the cleared ground that showed a wide road of hard-packed clay climbing the gentle slope of the 10-span-high ridge on its way to the river Aranin. Aramilla had camps beyond that ridge. Given the news, they might be empty. With luck, they were. But she could not concern herself with them now in any event. Forward and deploy as ordered, Gaibon shouted, and spurred his tall bay through, followed by the gathered nobles and the guardsmen 10 abreast. The guardsmen began curling off to the left and out of sight, while the nobles took a position a little up the ridge. Some began peering toward the city through looking glasses. Gaibon dismounted and ran, crouching to peer over the crest through his. Birgitta could almost feel the impatience of the guardswomen waiting behind her. You did not need a gateway this large, Shanella said, frowning at the column of horsemen flowing into the gateway. Why, come with me, Birgitta said, taking the Windfinder by her arm. I want to show you something. Pulling the Dun along by his reins, she began drawing the woman toward the gateway. You can come back once you've seen it. If she knew the least thing about Shanella, she was the one guiding the circle. For the rest, she was counting on human nature. She did not look back, yet she nearly sighed with relief when she heard the other Windfinders murmuring among themselves behind her, following her. Whatever Gaibon had seen, it was good news, because he straightened up before running back down to his horse. Aramilla must have stripped her camps to the bone. Make it 20,000 at the Farmading gate, then, if not more. The light send it was holding. The light send everywhere was holding. But Elaine first. First and above all else. When she reached Gaibon, who was back on his bay, the guardswomen arrayed themselves in 3 lines behind Casela off to one side. The whole 100-pace width of the gateway was filled with men and horses now, trotting as they hurried left and right to join the others already forming in 3 ranks that grew to either side of the road. Good. There would be no easy way for the Windfinders to duck back through for a little while. A wagon with an arched canvas cover and a 4-horse team, surrounded by a small mounted party, was halted in the road just beyond the last buildings of Low Camelin, perhaps a mile distant. Beyond it, people bustled in the open brick markets that lined the road, going about their lives as best they could, but they might as well not have existed. Elaine was in that wagon. Birgitta raised her hand without taking her eyes from the vehicle, and Gaibon put his brass-mounted looking-glass in her palm. Wagon and riders leaped closer when she raised the tube to her eye. "What did you want me to see?" Chanella demanded. "In a moment," Birgitta replied. There were 4 men, 3 of them mounted, but more important were the 7 women on horseback. It was a good-looking glass, but not good enough for her to make out an ageless face at that distance. Still, she had to assume all 7 were Aes Sedai. 8 against 7 might have seemed almost even odds, but not when the 8 were linked. Not if she could make the 8 take part. What were the Dark Friends thinking? Seeing thousands of soldiers and armsmen appear from behind what would seem to them a heat haze hanging in the air. She lowered the glass. Noblemen were beginning to ride down as their armsmen came out and went to join the lines. However surprised the Dark Friends were, they did not dither long. Lightning began flashing down out of a clear sky, silver-blue bolts that struck the ground with thunderous crashes and threw men and horses like splashed mud. Horses reared and plunged and screamed, but men fought to control their mounts, to hold their places. No one ran. The booming thunder that accompanied those blasts struck Birgitta like blows, staggering her. She could feel her hair stirring, trying to rise out of her braid. The air smelled sharp. It seemed to tingle. Again, lightning lashed the ranks. In Low Camelin, people were running away. Most were running away, but some fools actually ran to where they could have a better view. The ends of narrow streets opening onto the countryside began filling with spectators. "If we're going to face that, we might as well be moving and make it harder for them," Gaibon said, gathering his reins. "With your permission, my lady." "We'll lose fewer if you're moving," Birgitta agreed, and he spurred down the ridge. Hasela halted her horse in front of Birgitta and saluted, an arm across her chest. Her narrow face was grim behind the face bars of her lacquered helmet. "Permission for the bodyguard to join the line, my lady?" You could hear the capital. They were not just any bodyguard. They were the daughter heir's bodyguard, and would be the queen's bodyguard. "Granted," Birgitta said. "If anyone had a right, these women did." The Arafellan whirled her horse and galloped down the slope, followed by the rest of the bodyguard to take their place in those lightning-torn ranks. A company of mercenaries, perhaps 200 men in black-painted helmets and breastplates, riding behind a red banner bearing a running black wolf, halted when they saw what they were riding into. But men behind the banners of half a dozen houses pushed past them, and they had no choice but to go on. More noblemen rode down to lead their men. Brannon and Kelwyn, Laerid and Beryl, others. None hesitated once he saw his own banner appear. Sergei's was not the only woman to move her horse a few paces, as if she, too, meant to join with her armsmen when her banner came out of the gateway. "At a walk!" Gaibon shouted, to be heard over the explosions. All along the line, other voices echoed him. "Advance!" Wheeling his bay, he rode slowly toward the dark friend Aes Sedai, while lightning boomed and crashed, and men and horses flew in fountains of earth. "What did you want me to see?" Chanella demanded again. "I want to be away from this place." Small danger of that for the moment. Men were still coming out of the gateway, galloping or running to catch up. Fireballs fell among them now, adding their own eruptions of dirt, arms, legs. A horse's head spun lazily into the air. "This," Birgitta said, gesturing to the scene in front of them. Gaibon had begun to trot, pulling the others with him, the 3 ranks holding steady in their advance, others coming as hard as they could to join them. Abruptly, a leg-thick bar of what appeared to be liquid white fire shot out from one of the women beside the wagon. It quite literally carved a gap 15 paces wide in the lines. For a heartbeat, shimmering flecks floated in the air. The shapes of men and horses struck, and then were consumed. The bar suddenly jerked up into the air, higher and higher, then winked out, leaving dim purple lines across Birgitta's vision. Balefire. Burning men out of the pattern so that they were dead before it struck them. She swung the looking glass up to her eye long enough to spot the woman holding a slim black rod that appeared to be perhaps a pace long. Gaibon began to charge. It was too soon, but his only hope was to close while he still had men alive. His only hope but one. Over the thunderous explosions of fireballs and lightning rose a ragged cry of, "Elaine and Andor!" Ragged but full-throated. The banners were all streaming. A brave sight, if you could ignore how many were falling. A horse and rider struck squarely by a fireball simply disintegrated. Men and horses all around them going down as well. Some managed to rise again. A riderless horse stood on 3 legs, tried to run and fell over, thrashing. "This?" Shanella said incredulously. "I have no desire to watch men die." Another bar of balefire sliced a breach of nearly 20 paces in the charging ranks before knifing down into the ground, cutting a trench halfway back to the wagon before it vanished. There were a good many dead, though not so many as it seemed there should be. Birgitta had seen the same in battles during the Trolloc Wars where the power had been used. For every man who lay still, 2 or 3 were staggering to their feet or trying to stem a flow of blood. For every horse stiff-legged in death, 2 more stood on wobbly legs. The hail of fire and lightning continued unabated. "Then stop it," Birgitta said. "If they kill all the soldiers, or just enough to make the rest break, then Elaine is lost. Not forever. Burn her, she would track her for the rest of her life to see her free. But the light only knew what they might do to her in that time. Zaida's bargain is lost. You will have lost it." The morning was not warm, yet sweat beaded on Shanella's forehead. Fireballs and lightning erupted among the riders following Gaibon. The woman holding the rod raised her arm again. Even without using the looking glass, Birgitta was sure it was pointed straight at Gaibon. He had to see it, but he never swerved a hair. Suddenly another bolt of lightning slashed down and struck the woman holding the rod. She flew in one direction, her mount in another. One of the wagon teams sagged to the ground while the others danced and reared. They would have run except for their dead tracemate. The other horses around the wagon were rearing and plunging too. The rain of fire and lightning ceased as the Aes Sedai fought to control their horses, to maintain their saddles. Rather than trying to calm his team, the man on the driver's seat leaped down and drew his sword as he began to run toward the charging horsemen. The onlookers in Low Camelin were running again too, this time away. "Take the others alive," Birgitta snapped. She did not much care whether they lived. They would die soon enough for being dark friends and murderers, but Elaine was in that bloody wagon. Shanella nodded stiffly, and around the wagon, riders began toppling from their fractious mounts to lie struggling on the ground as if bound hand and foot. Which they were, of course. The running man fell on his face and lay writhing. "I shielded the women too," Shanella said. "Even holding the power, they would have been no match for a circle of 8. Gaibon raised his hand, slowing the charge to a walk. It was remarkable how short a time it all had taken. He was less than halfway to the wagon. Men mounted and afoot were still pouring out of the gateway. Swinging into the Dun's saddle, Birgitta galloped toward Elaine. Bloody woman, she thought. The bond had never once carried any hint of fear.
I'll be right back.
Chapter 33. 9 out of 10. Dark Friends had taken no chances with Elaine. Aside from shielding her, Tamala had taken seemingly malicious pleasure in tying her in a tight knot with her head between her knees. Her muscles already ached from the cramped position. The gag, a dirty piece of rag with a vile, oily taste, tied so tightly that it dug into the corners of her mouth, had been meant to keep her from shouting for help at the gates. Not that she would have. All that would have done was sentence the men guarding the gates to death. She could feel the 6 Black Sisters holding Saidar until they were through the gate. But the blindfold had been an unnecessary touch. She thought they wanted to add to her sense of helplessness, yet she refused to feel helpless. After all, she was perfectly safe until her babies were born, and so were her babies. Min had told her so. She knew she was in a wagon or cart by the sound of harness and the feel of rough boards beneath her. They had not bothered to pad the floorboards with a blanket. A wagon, she thought. There seemed to be more than one horse pulling it. The wagon box smelled of old hay so strongly that she wanted to sneeze. Her situation seemed hopeless, but Birgitta would not fail her. She felt Birgitta leap from somewhere miles behind her to perhaps a mile ahead, and she wanted to laugh. The bond said Birgitta was aimed at her target, and Birgitta's silver bow never missed. When the channeling started on both sides of the wagon, the desire to laugh faded. Determination held rock steady in the bond, but there was something else as well now. A strong distaste and a rising, not anger, but close. Men would be dying out there. Instead of laughing, Elaine wanted to weep for them. They deserved someone to weep for them, and they were dying for her, as Vandine and Saritha had died. Sadness for them welled up in her again. No guilt, though. Only by letting Thalion and Marilyn walk free could they have been spared, and neither would have countenanced that. There had been no way to anticipate the arrival of the others, or that strange weapon Asmi had. A thunderous crash came close at hand, and her conveyance was jolted so violently that she bounced on the floorboards. Her knees and shins were going to be bruised from that. She sneezed in the dust that had risen with her, sneezed again. She could feel individual hairs lifting where they were not held down by the gag and blindfold. The air smelled peculiar. A lightning strike, it appeared. She hoped Birgitta had managed to involve the Windfinders, unlikely as that seemed. The time would come when the kin would have to use the power as a weapon. No one could stand aside from Tarman Gaiden, but let them preserve their innocence a little longer. Moments later, the shield on her vanished. Unable to see, she could not channel to any real purpose, but she could sense weaves near her, some of spirit, some of air. Without seeing the weaves, she was unable to know what they were, yet she could make a reasonable guess. Her captors were themselves captives now, shielded and bound, and all she could do was wait impatiently. Birgitta was coming closer rapidly, yet now she felt anxious to have that bloody web of ropes off her. The wagon box creaked as someone heaved herself in. Birgitta. The bond carried a flash of joy. In moments, the ropes fell away from her, and Birgitta's hands went to the knot of the gag. Moving a little stiffly, Elaine untied the blindfold herself. Light, she was going to ache like fury until she could ask for healing. That reminded her that she would have to ask the Windfinders, and the sadness rose all over again for Vandine and Saritha. Once she could spit out the gag, she wanted to ask for water to wash away the oily taste, but instead she said, "What kept you?" Her laughter at the other woman's sudden consternation was cut short by another sneeze. "Let's get out of here, Birgitta." "The kin?" "Windfinders," Birgitta answered, holding open the canvas flap at the back of the wagon. Chanella decided she'd rather not report losing her bargain to Zaida. Elaine sniffed in disdain. A mistake. Sneezing repeatedly, she climbed down from the wagon as quickly as she could manage. Her legs were as stiff as her arms. Burn her, but she wanted a hot bath. A hairbrush. Birgitta's white-collared red coat looked somewhat rumpled, but Elaine suspected she made her warder appear fresh from the dressing room. When her feet hit the ground, mounted guardsmen in a thick ring around the wagon raised a loud cheer, shaking their lances in the air. Guardswomen whooped too, apparently almost every last one of them. Two of the men bore Andor's white lion and her golden lily. That brought a smile. The Queen's guards were sworn to defend Andor, the Queen, and the daughter heir, yet the decision to carry her personal banner had to have been Charles Gaibon's. Sitting a tall bay with his helmet resting on the saddle bow, he bowed to her, a broad smile on his lips. The man was a pleasure to look at. Perhaps he would do for a third warder. Beyond the guards rose house banners and banners of mercenary companies, banner after banner. Light! How many men had Birgitta brought? That could be answered later, though. First, Elaine wanted to see her prisoners. Asni lay spread-eagled on the road, her empty eyes staring at the sky. The shield on her was unneeded. The others lay as still, bound with flows of air that held their arms to their sides and snugged their divided skirts against their legs. A much more comfortable position than she had been in. Most seemed remarkably composed, considering their situation, though Tamila scowled at her, and Phalion appeared about to sick up. Cheyenne's mud-smeared face would have done credit to any Aes Sedai. The three men bound with air were anything but composed. They writhed and struggled, glaring at the riders surrounding them as if they wanted nothing more than to attack them all. That was enough to identify them as Asni's warders, though not necessarily as dark friends. Whether they were or not, they would still have to be imprisoned, to protect others from the death rage that Asni's death had filled them with. They would do anything to kill whomever they held responsible. "How did they find us?" Chesmal demanded. If she had not been lying in the road with the dirty face, no one would have thought her a prisoner. "My warder," Elaine said, smiling at Birgitta, one of them. "A woman warder," Chesmal said disdainfully. Marilyn shook in her bonds with silent laughter for a moment. "I'd heard that," she said when the shaking ceased, "but it seemed too incredible to be true." "You heard this and you never mentioned it?" Tamila said, twisting around to transfer her scowl to Marilyn. "You great fool!" "You forget yourself," Marilyn said sharply, and the next instant they were arguing about whether Tamila should defer to her. In truth, Tamila should. Elaine could sense their relative strengths, yet it hardly seemed a topic they would argue over now. "Somebody gag these women," Elaine ordered. Casella dismounted, handing her reins to another guardswoman, and strode over to begin cutting a strip from Tamila's skirts with her dagger. "Load them into the wagon and cut away that dead horse. I want to get back inside the walls before Aramilla's people beyond the ridge feel tempted." The last thing she needed now was a pitched battle. Whatever the outcome, Aramilla could afford to lose more men than she. "Where are the Windfinders, Birgitta?" "Still on the ridge. I think they believe they can deny taking part if they don't get too near the carnage. But you don't have to worry about being attacked here. The camps beyond the ridge are empty." Casella hoisted Tamila over her shoulder and staggered over to heave her into the wagon like a sack of grain. Guards women were picking up the other women, too. They wisely left the struggling warders to the guardsmen. It required two to handle each of them. A pair of tall guardsmen were unfastening the dead horse's harness. "All I saw were camp followers, grooms and the like," Charles put in. "I think all of her camps may be empty," Birgitta went on. "She sent heavy assaults against the northern wall this morning to draw as many of our men as possible, and she has 20,000 or more in Low Camelin below the Farmadding gate. Some of the mercenaries changed colors and are attacking it from inside, but I sent Dialin with everything I could spare. As soon as you're safe inside the walls, I'll take the rest to help her. To add to the good news, Luan and the rest of that lot are riding north. They could be here this afternoon." Elaine's breath caught. Luan and the rest would have to be dealt with when they appeared, but the other news... "Do you remember what Mistress Harfor reported, Birgitta? Aramilla and the others all intend to be with the first party to ride into Camelin. They must be outside the Farmadding gate, too. How many men do you have here?" "What's the butcher's bill, Gaibon?" Birgitta asked, eyeing Elaine warily. The bond carried wariness, too. Great wariness. "I don't have a full tally yet, my lady. Some of the bodies..." Charles grimaced. "I'd say as many as 500 or 600 dead, though, perhaps a few more. Twice as many wounded, one way and another. As nasty a few minutes as I've ever seen." "Call it 10,000, Elaine," Birgitta said, thick braids swaying as she shook her head. She tucked her thumbs behind her belt, and determination filled the bond. "Aramilla has to have at least twice that at the Farmadding gate, maybe 3 times if she's really stripped her camps. If you're thinking what I think you're thinking, I told Dialin to retake the gate if it had fallen, but it's more likely she's fighting Aramilla inside the city. If by some miracle the gate is holding, you're talking better than 2-to-1 odds against us." "If they're through the gate," Elaine said stubbornly, "it's unlikely they closed it behind them. We'll take them in the rear." It was not all stubbornness, not entirely. She had not trained with weapons, but she had received all of the other lessons Gawain had gotten from Gareth Bryn. A queen had to understand the battle plans her generals gave her, rather than simply accept them blindly. If the gate is holding, we'll have them trapped between us and the wall. Numbers won't count so much in Low Camelin. Aramilla won't be able to line up any more men across the street than we can. We are going to do it, Birgitta. Now somebody find me a horse. For a moment, she thought the other woman was going to refuse, which ratcheted up her stubbornness. But Birgitta exhaled heavily. Saigon, catch up that tall gray mare for Lady Elaine. It seemed that everyone around them except the Dark Friends sighed. They must have thought they were going to see a display of Elaine Tracan's fabled temper. Knowing that almost sparked one. Burn her bouncing moods. Stepping closer, Birgitta lowered her voice. But you'll ride surrounded by your bodyguard. This isn't some fool's story with a queen carrying her banner into battle to lead her troops. I know one of your ancestors did that, but you're not her, and you don't have a broken army to rally. Why, that was exactly my plan, Elaine said sweetly. How did you guess? Birgitta snorted with laughter and muttered, bloody woman. Not quite softly enough to escape detection. Affection flowed in the bond, though. It was not so simple, of course. Men had to be told off to help the wounded. Some could walk, but many could not. Too many had tourniquets around the bloody stump of an arm or a leg. Charles and the nobles gathered around Elaine and Birgitta to hear the plan, which was simple of necessity. But then Chanella refused to change the gateway, until Elaine agreed that this time they need provide transport only, and sealed the agreement with them both kissing their fingertips and pressing them to the other's lips. Only then did the gateway dwindle to a vertical silvery slash, and widen again into a 100-pace wide view of Camelin from the south. There were no people in the brick markets lining the wide road that ran north from the gateway to the Farmading gate, but a great mass of men, mounted and afoot, crowded the road out of bowshot from the walls. The first of them was only a few hundred paces from the gateway. It appeared that they spilled into the side streets too. The mounted men were to the front with a thicket of banners, but cavalry or infantry, they were all looking toward the gates of Camelin itself. Closed gates. Elaine could have shouted for joy. She rode through first, but Birgitta was taking no chances. Her bodyguard gathered around her, herding her off to one side. Birgitta was right by her side, but somehow they did not seem to be herding her. Fortunately, no one tried to object to her pushing the grey forward, until only a single line of guardswomen was between her and the road. That line might as well have been a stone wall. The grey was indeed tall, however, so she could see without standing in the stirrups. She should have lengthened those. They were just a little short for her. That made this Chesmal's horse, since she was the only one who came close to her own height. A horse could not be tainted by its rider. Just because Chesmal was Black Aja did not make it. But she felt uncomfortable on the animal for more than short stirrups. Grey would be sold. The Grey and all the other horses the Dark Friends had been riding, and the money distributed to the poor. Cavalry and foot came out of the gateway behind Charles, enough to fill it from side to side. Followed by the White Lion and the Golden Lily, he started up the road at a trot, with 500 guardsmen spread out to cover the width of the road. Other parties of similar size split off and vanished into the streets of Low Camelin. When the last men exited the gateway, it dwindled and vanished. Now there was no quick escape if anything went wrong. Now they had to win, or Aramilla would as good as have the throne whether or not she had Camelin. We need Matt Cawthon's bloody luck today, Birgitta muttered. You said something like that before, Elaine said. What do you mean? Birgitta gave her a peculiar look. The bond carried amusement. Have you ever seen dicing? I hardly spend much time in places where there's dicing, Birgitta. Let's just say he's luckier than any other man I've ever met. Shaking her head, Elaine put Matt Cawthon out of her mind. Charles's men were shutting off her view as they rode forward, not charging yet, trying to make no more noise than absolutely necessary. With a little luck, her men would have Aramilla's surrounded before they knew what was happening, and then they would hit Aramilla from every side. Matt was the luckiest man Birgitta had ever met. In that case, he must be very lucky indeed. Suddenly, Charles's guardsmen were moving faster, their steel-tipped lances swinging down. Someone must have looked back. Shouts rose, cries of alarm, and one thunderous shout she heard repeated from many directions. Elaine and Andor! There were
Hey,
other cries
just
as
chilling.
well.
How you doing?
The moons and the fox, the triple keys and the hammer and the black banner. Others for lesser houses. But from her side came only the one, repeated again and again. Elaine and Andor! Suddenly she was shaking, half laughing, half weeping. The light sensed she was not consigning those men to their deaths for nothing. The cries faded, largely replaced by the clash of steel on steel, by shouts and screams as men killed or died. Abruptly she realized the gates were swinging out, and she could not see. Kicking her feet free of the stirrups, she clambered up to stand on the high-cantled saddle. Gray shifted nervously, unaccustomed to being a step stool, but not enough to disturb her balance. Birgitta muttered a particularly pungent oath, but the next moment she was standing...
Hell yeah, just chilling.
Hundreds of
Oh, it hasn't been
crossbowmen
too
and
bad. I
archers were
can't
pouring out
complain.
the Farmadding gate.
Well, I can, but you know how that
Renegade
goes.
mercenaries. For answer, archers began firing at Aramella's massed cavalry as fast as they could knock and draw. The first crossbows...
How
went
you
up and
been?
loosed
Just
a volley.
chilling?
Immediately, those men began working their cranks to rewind their crossbows, but others rushed past them to loose a second flight of bolts that cut down men and horses like scythes reaping barley. More archers spilled out of the gate, firing as fast as they could. A third rank of crossbow men ran forward to fire, a fourth, a fifth, and then men wielding halberds were pushing past the crossbowmen still running out of the gate. A halberd was a fearsome weapon, combining spear point and axe blade with a hook for pulling men out of the saddle. Horsemen with no room to charge their lances, their swords outreached by the halberd's long haft, began falling. Men in red coats and burnished breastplates were galloping out of the gate now, guardsmen swinging to left and right to find another way to get at Aramella's ranks. The flow of them went on and on, unceasing. How in the light could Dylan have so many of the guards? Unless... Burn the woman. She must have scooped up the half-trained men. Well, half-trained or not, they would be anointed in blood today. Suddenly, 3 figures in gilded helmets and breastplates rode through the gates, swords in hand. 2 of them were very small. The shouts that rose when they appeared were thin with distance, but still...
Hell yeah, just chilling.
The Black Eagles, and the Anvil, and the Red Leopards. 2 mounted women appeared in the gate, struggling until the taller managed to pull the other's horse back out of sight. Blood and bloody ashes, Elaine snapped. Conal's old enough, I suppose, but Bramlett and Paraval are boys. Somebody should have kept them out of that. Dylan held them back long enough, Birgitta said calmly. The bond carried bone-deep.
Alright, that's pretty much all you could do.
I thought she could hold Conal, and she did manage to keep Catelyn out of it. Anyway, the boys have a few hundred men between them and the forefront, and I don't see anyone trying to make room for them to squeeze forward. It was true. The 3 were waving their swords impotently at least 50 paces from where men were dying. But then 50 paces was a short range for bow or crossbow. Men began appearing on the rooftops, first dozens, then hundreds, archers and crossbowmen climbing over the roof peaks, working their way across the slates like spiders until they could shoot down into the packed mass below. One slipped and fell, his body lying atop the men in the street and jerking as it was stabbed repeatedly. Another suddenly reared up, a shaft sticking out of his side, and toppled from his perch. He also lay atop the men in the street, twitching as he was stabbed again and again. They're jammed together too tightly, Birgitta said excitedly. They can't raise a bow, much less draw one. I'll wager the dead don't even have room to fall down. It won't be
Oh
long.
no, I'm not. There's nowhere to go clubbing around here.
For a good half hour before the first shouts of quarter.
And even there was, I probably wouldn't
Men
go.
began hanging their
Just 'cause I don't
helmets
like
on swords and raising them
being
overhead,
around a lot of
risking
people.
death in the hope of life. Footmen stripped off helmets and held their hands up empty. Horsemen flung down lances, helmets, swords, and raised their hands. It spread like a fever, the cry bellowing from thousands of throats. Quarter! Elaine sat down on her saddle properly. It was done. Now to learn how well it had been done. The fighting did not stop immediately, of course. Some tried to fight on, but they fought alone and died, or were pulled down by men around them who were no longer ready to die. At last, however, even the most diehard began shedding weapons and armor, and if not every voice cried for quarter, the roar was still thunderous. Weaponless men shorn of helmets and breastplates and any other armor they might have worn began staggering through the line of guardsmen, hands above their heads. Halberdmen herded them like sheep. They had something of the stunned look of sheep in a slaughter yard. The same thing must have been being repeated on dozens of Low Canelan's narrow streets and at the gates, because the only shouts she heard were for quarter, and those were beginning to dwindle as men realized it was being granted. The sun lacked no more than an hour of its noonday peak by the time the nobles were all separated out. The lesser were escorted inside the city, where they would be held for ransom, to be paid once the throne was secure. The first of the greater nobles to be brought to her, escorted by Charles and a dozen guardsmen, were Aramilla, Nayan, and Elenia. Charles had a bloody gash down his left sleeve and a dent in his shining breastplate that must have been made by a hammer blow, but his features were composed behind the face bars of his helmet. She heaved a huge sigh of relief to see the three women. Among the dead or among the captives, the others would be found. She had decapitated her opposition, at least until Luan and the others arrived. The guardswomen in front of her at last moved aside so she could confront her prisoners. The three were garbed as if they had intended to attend Aramilla's coronation that very day. Her red silk dress was sewn with seed pearls on the bosom and embroidered with rearing white lions marching up the sleeves. Swaying in her saddle, she had the same stunned look in her brown eyes that her soldiers had. Nayan, slim and straight-backed in blue with the silver triple keys of a Ron climbing her sleeves, and silver scroll work across her bosom, her gleaming black hair caught in a silver net set with sapphires, seemed subdued rather than numb. She even managed to sneer, though it was weak. Honey-haired Elenia, in green elaborately embroidered with gold, shared her glares between Aramilla and Elaine. The bond carried equal measures of triumph and disgust. Birgitta's dislike of these women was as personal as Elaine's own. "You will be my guests at the palace for the time being," Elaine told them. "I hope your coffers are deep. Your ransoms will pay for this war you've caused." That was malicious of her, but she felt spiteful all of a sudden. Their coffers were not deep at all. They had borrowed far more than they could repay in order to hire mercenaries and bribe mercenaries. They faced ruin without any ransom. With, they faced devastation. "You cannot believe it ends this way," Aramilla said hoarsely. She sounded as if she were trying to convince herself. "Jared is still in the field with a considerable force. Jared and others, tell her, Elenia. Jared will try to preserve what he can of Saran from this disaster you forced us into," Elenia snarled. They began shouting at one another, but Elaine ignored them. She wondered how they would enjoy sharing a bed with Naya. Next to appear under escort was Lear Barin, and moments later, Karind Anshar. As slender as a blade and as strong, Lear wore a thoughtful expression rather than defiant or sullen. His green coat, embroidered with the silver-winged hammer of House Barin on the high collar, bore the marks of the breastplate he was no longer wearing, and his dark hair was matted with sweat. More glistened on his face. He had not gotten so sweaty watching other men fight. Karind was garbed as grandly as the other women, in shimmering blue silk, heavy with silver braid.
Hell yeah, just chilling.
Hair. Her square face looked resigned, especially after
That's badass, bro.
their ransoms. Neither had borrowed as heavily as the other three, so far as she knew, but that ransom would still cut deep. Then two guardsmen appeared with a woman a little older than Elaine in simple blue. A woman she thought she recognized.
Excuse me.
A single enameled brooch, a red star and silver sword on glittering black appeared to be her only jewelry. But why was Sylvain's Karen being brought to her? A pretty woman with alert blue eyes that held steady on Elaine's face. She was Lord Nason's heir, not the high seat of Karen. "Karen stands for Trakand," Sylvain said shockingly as soon as she reined in. Bond echoed Elaine's startlement. Aramilla gaped at Sylvain as if she were mad. "My grandfather suffered a seizure, Aramilla," the young woman said calmly. and my cousins fell over themselves, affirming me as High Seat. I will publish it, Elaine, if you wish. That might be best, Elaine said slowly. Publication would make her support irrevocable. This would not be the first time a house had switched sides, even without the death of a High Seat, but best to be certain. Trakand welcomes Karen warmly, Sylvaise. Best not to be too distant, either. She knew little of Sylvaise Karen. Sylvaise nodded, accepting. So she had at least a degree of intelligence. She knew she would not be fully trusted until she demonstrated her loyalty by sending out the proclamations of support. If you trust me a little, may I have custody of Aramilla, Nayan, and Elenia? In the royal palace, of course, or wherever you choose to house me. I believe my new secretary, Master Lunald, may be able to convince them to throw their support to you. For some reason, Nayan gave a loud cry and would have fallen from her saddle if a guardsman had not grabbed her arm to support her. Aramilla and Elenia both appeared ready to sick up. I think not, Elaine said. No proposed conversation with the secretary produced those reactions. It seemed Sylvaise had a hard core to her. Nayan and Elenia have published their support of Aramilla. They'll hardly destroy themselves by recanting. That truly would destroy them. Smaller houses sworn to them would begin falling away until their own house dwindled in importance. They themselves might not survive as High Seats much beyond announcing that they now stood for Trakand. And as for Aramilla, Elaine would not allow Aramilla to change her tune. She would refuse the woman's support if it were offered. Something grim entered Sylvaise's gaze as she glanced at the three women. They might, with the proper persuasion. Oh yes, a very hard core. But as you wish, Elaine. Be very careful of them, though. Treachery is in their blood and bones. Barin stands for Trakand, Lear announced suddenly. I too will publish it, Elaine. Anshar stands for Trakand, Karen said in firm tones. I will send the proclamations out today. Traitors! Aramilla cried. I'll see you dead for this. She fumbled at her belt where a dagger's scabbard hung, jeweled and empty, as if she intended to see to the matter herself. Elenia began to laugh, but she did not sound amused. It sounded almost like weeping. Elaine drew a deep breath. Now she had 9 of the 10 houses needed. She was under no illusions. Whatever Sylvaise's reasons, Lear and Karen were trying to salvage what they could by cutting themselves loose from a lost cause and themselves to one that suddenly appeared to be rising. They would expect her to give them preferment for standing for her before she had the throne, while forgetting that they had ever supported Aramilla. She would do neither. But neither could she reject them out of hand. Trakand welcomes... Never warmly, though. Never that. Trakand welcomes Anshar. Captain Gaibon, get the prisoners into the city as soon as you can. Armsmen for Karen, Barin, and Anshar will be restored their weapons and armor once the proclamations have been sent out. But they can have their banners back now. He saluted her and wheeled his bay, already shouting orders. As she heeled the gray toward Dylan, who was riding out of a side street, followed by Catalin and the 3 young fools in their gilded armor, Sylvaise, Lear, and Karen fell in behind her and Birgitta. She felt no disquiet having them at her back, not with 100 guardswomen at theirs. They would be watched very closely until those proclamations were sent, including Sylvaise. Elaine's mind was already casting itself ahead. You're awfully quiet, Birgitta said softly. Just won a great victory. And in a few hours, she replied, I'll learn whether I have to win another.
Chapter 34. A cup of cough. Beric Kareed pressed his gauntleted fist to his heart, returning the sentry's salute, and ignored them.
Excuse me. Alright, everyone, I'm gonna call into this stream for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support.